chair of the board, if any of you didn't know that. Anyway, we do have a wonderful presentation today by Katelyn VerMerris, our new director. Some upcoming events are up here, and we hope that you get out to them. Next week, we have our ice cream social. We have 2 more things going on with the schoolhouse. We have a presentation. It will be at the Second Reformed Church on the renovation of their organ. And then we have our annual dinner coming up on the 28th. And we're still kind of discussing options on that, depending on the virus. We might actually do 3 seatings even if we need to be in smaller groupings. But we're talking about a lot of options, and it is going to take place on the 28th, no matter what's happening, we think. Anyway, welcome, like I said, and I'd like to introduce our director, Katelyn VerMerris.
Hi everyone, I'm going to switch slideshows real quick. Well, thank you all for coming. This was really exciting for me because I researched World War I, the work of women in Grand Rapids for my master's thesis. And so when I started at Zeeland, I thought, I want to know what was going on in Zeeland. So this was really exciting for me as an excuse to research what was happening here and learn a little bit about it. And there's still a lot that I want to explore, so I'm excited for some of the people who are here who can add in what they know as well. So I have presented on women's work in Grand Rapids several times, including at the Midwestern History Association. So some of the stuff here is new content to me, which is, as I said, really exciting. So I just wanted to give a broad overview of the war for those of you who aren't familiar or just need a reminder of it, of the context. So the war began in Europe in July of 1914, and the U.S. watched it really closely. There were a lot of mixed opinions about whether we should join in or not. So we did officially join in on April 6th of 1917. This was 3 years after the war had raged on. And then the war ended in November of 1918, so we were in it for about 1 year and 6 months. That's the scope of the wartime economy that we had. So after joining the war, we needed to mobilize. We needed to do the draft. We needed to fund it. So there was a lot of initiatives to mobilize the country for the war. There was a lot of concern, though, for Woodrow Wilson, the federal government, about affecting the wartime economy after the war. So they didn't want to raise taxes, and they didn't want government initiatives such as government farming initiatives. They didn't want the government to start new programs to do it. So what they did is enacted a civilian mobilization strategy. They coordinated the efforts of the committees and other people already doing the work to create the production needed for the war. And they sold bonds and other things so they didn't have to raise taxes permanently. So in organizations like the Food Administration, what they did was they coordinated citizens, farmers, and commercial enterprises and distribution, but they didn't establish any new governmental agencies to do the work itself. One of the things they also did immediately was establish the Committee on Public Information, the CPI. This was to manage wartime messages and create a, quote, correct opinion on the war. So the CPI made it the responsibility of the state to cultivate patriotism, and you'll see some strong messaging that went along with that in the presentation. For women's clubs, this also mounted a lot of pressure to do volunteer work for the war and to shift the focus of existing women's clubs to do things for the war. So you'll see some examples of that as well. So one of the first things I'm going to talk about is the Liberty Bonds campaign. So as I said, they needed to fund the war and they didn't want to raise taxes. So throughout the war, there were 4 different Liberty Bonds campaigns. In Zeeland, the war board was created of prominent leaders. You'll see the names down here. John Friss, William Hefja. I was going to say, I didn't even want to say that. John Hahn, John Dupree, Martin Verhage, and Herman Miller. So you see, I mean, the biggest names, some of the biggest names in the community were put on this award board to convince people to buy the war bonds and fundraise for it. And for at least the second and third campaigns, they went door to door to every home, canvassing every home in Zeeland to ask people to buy war bonds. And they even got the Boy Scouts to do it. So that was a common thing in other cities too, is getting children involved and children's groups to go door to door asking people to buy war bonds, because how can you say no to a 10-year-old boy asking you? I didn't see any evidence in Zeeland yet, but I know in Grand Rapids there was a junior Red Cross group that did this as a primary purpose as well. So I spent a lot of time looking for the Zeeland record, and Liberty bonds were all over the Zeeland record during this time. So these are just a couple of the many advertisements I saw. So you can see some of the imagery and rhetoric that accompanied it. Obviously, Uncle Sam was big in World War I, so that's a good example of an Uncle Sam on the left there. The second one is an advertisement for the Ted and Ed clothing company, which is actually kind of unique. In Grand Rapids, there were a lot of businesses that their advertisements used war rhetoric to sell. I didn't see a lot of that in Zeeland, but this is one example that I did see where it was an advertisement for clothing, but they are also advertising Liberty bonds. Another thing was people were encouraged to take out loans if they couldn't afford bonds. So bonds started at $50, which was kind of a steep price at the time as an entry level. So Zeeland State Bank advertised a lot about how they were offering loans for people to buy bonds to loan their money to the government. At interest rates, of course. And the last one shows, we'll see a lot, there was a high focus on, there is some way everybody can serve the war. So if you can't enlist, you can buy bonds. If you can't buy bonds, you can knit. If you can't knit, there's a million ways you can serve the war. So you'll see that a lot too. If you can't enlist, your money can't volunteer your cash. There were also a number of meetings to promote the Liberty Bond campaign. So this was a quote that I took from the record that was from a speech given at Second Reformed Church, to promote Liberty Bonds. And I just thought the rhetoric in this was so interesting. I'm going to read the whole thing to you. The climax of the slacker spirit was reached, in our opinion, when one day, the past week, we approached one party who refused to buy a bond, although his finances would certainly permit of several $100s worth, if not thousands. This party has a son in the Army who must be fed, clothed, and armed, and for all this party will do, his son must stand in the front line naked and hungry, ready to be done worse than butchered by our most savage and desperate army of men. Mr. Man, have you thought this over? When your son comes back home, probably maimed, are you going to face him and say, no, I didn't buy a bond. I figured that George was doing that. I gave you up, but I didn't stop to think that you were in need of anything. We had everything in plenty. There was enough for everybody, for you too. The government should have looked after that. I just thought the probably maimed. And the speculation of how much money this man could have given. I saw that several times too from people. They didn't name names, but there was a lot of speculation of this person could have given more but didn't. And they were viewed negatively for that. So if you couldn't afford a bond, you could buy a thrift stamp, because those started at 25 cents. When 16 of these were collected, they could be exchanged for a war savings certificate, which bore interest and compounded quarterly at 4%, and they were tax-free. So it was no excuse to say you can't give any money. If you can't buy a bond, you can buy thrift stamps. So another thing that was prevalent was food conservation. So recipes were distributed for how to cook thriftily. People were encouraged to raise their own gardens. They were encouraged to raise their own chickens so that they didn't have to buy chicken from the store. They were also asked to save their fat and reuse it, so don't throw anything out. In January of 1918, there was also a sugar shortage in Zeeland. So every family was given a card with the number of people in it and how much they were allotted for sugar. And all the grocers were given names of who could buy sugar and how much they could buy, so that it limited how much sugar everyone was using. There was also a fuel shortage throughout the war, and so fuel conservation was promoted throughout the whole war. But this was especially true in January of 2018, because there was a train that was robbed en route to Zeeland, and 50% of its coal was stolen. So, in January of 1918, Zeeland had to ask businesses to give some of their coal rations to the city. So Wolverine Furniture Company was listed as one of the people who gave the most. And it was the middle of winter in January, so heating is important. So meetings all over were canceled, church services were canceled, and there was only one church holding a service, and everybody was encouraged to go to that one church or not go. People were encouraged to bunk up, so if you have family members with separate houses, go to one house and only heat that one house. And the Red Cross didn't meet in January because they didn't want to heat a meeting room. So I thought that was interesting that would have, I mean, already short rations and they were robbed of what little coal they already had. Another thing was there was a German registration, and there were a lot of evidence of fear of the enemy and Germans, and it was interesting to see how that enacted at home too. So everybody was required to register if they were of German descent, or not descent, if they were immigrants from Germany. And if they didn't have a card with them, they would be sent to an internment camp, and the one in Michigan was in Detroit. So also in April 1918, the Holland Public Schools voted to take German out of the curriculum, so nobody was allowed to learn German in the schools. There was a lot of fear associated with it. So this is an article I found on the screen talking about a settlement in West Olive of Germans. And it was saying there have been reports that they're harmless, however they are not buying Liberty bonds, so they are not patriotic. And I think that just shows there was a lot of fear. Oh, additionally I found an article that reported a couple people talking about where their sons were stationed in public places, such as the trains, and they were asked to keep quiet because there could be a German spy listening in. So they were asked not to discuss things like locations in public where anybody could overhear. So jumping into what I know the most about, we'll probably touch on some of the women's work during the war. So women were an important aspect of war mobilization because as men were being sent overseas, there was a lot of work to be done at home. And so nationally, there was in national and state publications, there are a lot of articles asking women to rise up. I did not see as much in Zeeland, actually. There were a couple. It was not near as prevalent as in Grand Rapids and other places I've looked at. So in Grand Rapids, in the Herald, every week they published an article on what women were doing for the war effort. There wasn't as much in Zeeland, but I have enough to think that this was still happening. They were doing the same kinds of things. So one of the organizations that was founded at the federal level to coordinate all war work was the Council of National Defense. There was a women's committee in the Council of National Defense that was tasked with coordinating all the women's efforts, especially protecting the American family. There was a lot of rhetoric about how women were needed to preserve their children and the American family as an institution from the disruption of the war. So very quickly, each state had their own committee, and there were 17,000 local committees that sprang up all over the country. So it was very effective mobilization because what they did is they tapped existing volunteer groups and leaders already in the community, like with the War Board, and asked them to do their work for the war efforts. They already had the connections, they already were doing work. So perhaps the biggest undertaking of the Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense was a registration campaign. So this took place during the week of April 27 and May 2 in 1918. It had the goal of registering every woman of what their skills are and what their interests are and how that can be used for the war effort. So the state leader of the Women's Committee, Katelyn Bosch, came and spoke in Zeeland. Apparently it was standing room only. And it was kicked off with Zeeland's own committee. So there was the state committee, and then there were all these little city committees. So in Ottawa County, there were 6 different committees, one of them in Zeeland. The Zeeland Record printed that this is the first time in history that the government is tabulating women's work and placing an economic value upon it. And since it is undertaken at the specific request of the government, it is an urgent appeal to every woman's patriotism. If you have even half a day to spare, there is a great deal of work calling to you. This is a government census, and whether or not you're able to offer or perform any service, it should include you and you should register. So it wasn't compulsory, but it was highly encouraged to register. So this is what one of the cards looks like. It had 165 occupations listed down here. So things like farming, sewing, knitting, clerical work, all sorts of things listed that you can either say you have that skill, or you could say you wanted training in that skill, and they would connect you to someone where you could get training for that skill. So one of the things that a lot of women wanted was motor car driving. That was something that they offered training in. And nursing was another big thing that you could get training in. And clerical work was another big thing you could get training in. So the goal of this was to direct women's skills. It's kind of like the draft, which we'll talk about, where you recognize everybody has a skill and interests, and it's not global. Everybody has something unique. So there's actually quite a few surviving collections of these. I haven't found Zeeland's yet. I'm hoping to stumble upon it in the archive. But the Grand Rapids Public Library has 23,000 of these from women in Grand Rapids. So this is my plug. If you're into genealogy, and you might have had any women in your family living in Grand Rapids at the time, it's all digitized on their website. So you should go look it up because it's fun to see what you can find. And it has a lot of great information. The Zeeland chapter did go house to house canvassing, and it's reported that every woman in Zeeland registered. I don't know how accurate it is, but it literally said every woman in Zeeland is now registered. The Red Cross is another big avenue for women's work. So this wasn't just a women's organization, there were a lot of men involved, but it coordinated the efforts of women as well. And it was very active in Zeeland. There was a group that met twice a week to do Red Cross work in Zeeland. They raised money for supplies, they encouraged victory gardens, they also did a lot of knitting and a lot of sewing for the war. So women could pick up materials for their projects at the Red Cross office, and then they could take it home and bring it in. And it actually said Zeeland met their quota regularly for knitted materials. So some of the things that they would make were sweaters, trench caps, wristlets, socks, and they would sew pajamas, surgical socks, sponges, washcloths, handkerchiefs, a lot of materials for the war. There is a debate among historians about how much women's sewing efforts actually contributed to the war. Like, did it make a difference in the supplies? Because they are factories, textile factories that could make stuff much quicker. But there is a consensus that whether it did or not, it kept the war at the forefront of people's minds. So in your free time, if you're knitting for your boys overseas, that keeps the war at the forefront of your mind. There was also a big membership drive throughout the war, so you could become a member, and everybody was encouraged to become a member. It was also another way to give your dollars to the war, because they were constantly asking for money. So one of the other big things that the Red Cross oversaw was nursing. So I do know that there were some nurses from Zeeland who trained. I couldn't find a list of names or their specific circumstances, so that's something that I'm going to continue looking into. We do have a nursing uniform at the museum, many of you have seen, from a Miss Ada Hill. She was born in Zeeland, but she actually was from Paw Paw when she left to go overseas. But her nursing uniform is really cool still. It's a good example of what they would have worn. So something you can go look at next time you're at the museum if you haven't seen it yet. Nursing was also an area where many women gained professional experience, so that's some skills that they could take with them after the war if they got some nursing training. And nursing training was not just to send women overseas, it was also to replace nurses and needs at home when everybody else was mobilized. So the draft, another big thing that happened during World War I. And there's a lot to say about this, but so like I hinted at, this process was meant to take into account men's role in society. So there was a written questionnaire and a physical exam, and a big process for deciding who was important enough to stay, who did essential tasks at home, and who could be sent overseas and who was fit enough to go overseas. So there was a registration board in Zeeland. The first two members were D.F. Boonstra and Henry Roke. They had a goal for 200 men, actually 191. They first said 200, but then it was 191, to be registered by June 5, 1917. And then it took about 2 months to go through all the applications to get to that number, that 191 number. And actually they said they worked on Labor Day. So it was a lot of work to do the selective service. Also, additionally, men who were drafted had some say what aspect of the military they went into. So there was a lot of versatility there. So they had to examine 918 men to get the 191 quota. So one issue that also arose in Michigan that was interesting was they had to do a recount, because initially they filled out the cards numerically. Well, if you say everybody from the 2000s is being drafted, that means the entire town would have to go, because every town was gone numerically. So they had to go back through and draw names to reassign numbers, so it was randomized. So you didn't have one whole town's men being drafted. So even the military makes mistakes sometimes. As the war went on, the physical limitations were lowered. The draft numbers continued. There continued to be a rolling basis of numbers needed to fill for the quota. So some men that were initially not qualified because of physical limitations became qualified later in the war, especially with work, and they worked with physicians to get them approved so they could be drafted. This is on the screen is an image from our archive from Jacob Discipline, this is his draft notice to appeal for a physical examination in our archive. So after enlisting, a lot of men were sent to camps in Michigan. So two prominent ones were Grayling and Camp Custer. They reported, most of the letters from this time were very happy. They reported being well fed, having plenty of free time, many of the Zeeland boys sticking together, so they did a lot of fun with their friends. They would go swimming in the afternoons, they would drill for 4 hours and have a lot of free time, and they were well fed. Camp Custer even had some pet dogs, which were popular. So pictured here is some pictures that we have in our archive from the camps at home. So you see the tents and what the mess hall looked like and drills. The experience, outside of that, there was, every experience was particular. So there were a lot of letters printed, people with all different experiences. There were a lot of men who went down to Texas after being their first training in Michigan. There was a Camp MacArthur at Waco where a lot of Zeeland boys went. It was reported that a lot of them got sick from the water because there was different water down there. So there was a lot of boys who got sick and went to the hospital. There was also a lot of units who were quarantined when they first got there due to smallpox or measles outbreaks. So they would get there and then they'd have to be quarantined as a unit until everything cleared up. They traveled by train down to Michigan, or down to Texas, or other places. There was someone who went to Arizona, someone who went to New Jersey, so they were sent all over, but there were a lot who went to Texas. And then they started to be sent overseas, and so a lot of the guys overseas, there weren't as many letters that I found. A lot of the letters were found from camps in Michigan or from where they were sent afterwards. I had a couple of experiences that I was going to share. So there was an Anton Timmer, who was from Zeeland, who was in the Navy. So he talked about sleeping in hammocks and how he had four-hour watch shifts every 4 days. And Jarrett Clark was from Zeeland. He went to Fort Monroe, Virginia. He talked about being very busy. The only other person he knew there was Ed Dupree. And the fort also had a big moat with very accurate guns. He had a lot to say about the particular gun models. And then he also talked about this was the same fort that Jefferson Davis was in prison, so he regularly passed by his cell. There was another letter from San Antonio, Texas that talked about the Thanksgiving experience that he had. He described every food item, and it was a lot. He said they were well fed. Uncle Sam has not been starving his boys, is what he said. He also described the Thanksgiving Day races and football games that they played. He said he thinks he probably had a better holiday than his parents back home in Zeeland. So we have a number of postcards in our collection. One of them, this is one of them from Camp Custer. So you see a lot of them were printed with the camp, so they had images of what the camp looked like. And then on the back, he had written his news to his parents. There were a number of other pictures too. This was from another picture from Camp Custer. We had a lot of images from Camp Custer. So overseas, like I said, I couldn't find a lot of written accounts in our archive of what the experience was. There were a couple things. These are some pictures that we have. I want to learn more about this Mr. Behrens, who was an aerial photographer. I don't know much about him other than he was an aerial photographer, which is kind of cool. The picture on the left is one of the famous polar bears. So in 1918, many soldiers from Zeeland and Holland were integrated into the 339th Infantry and the 310th Engineers Unit, and they were sent to Russia during the November 11 World War I armistice. So originally they were sent to Russia to prevent a German advance and to help open the Eastern Front, but they ended up fighting Bolshevik revolutionaries for months after the armistice. So it's estimated they took over a year to get back because they were still there fighting revolutionaries after the war officially ended. So this group began referring to themselves as the Polar Bear Expedition because of the cold climate, and a lot of men from Zeeland, from Michigan and Wisconsin, the Midwest states, were specifically chosen because of their ability to withstand colder climates. Yeah, Kit?
Bruce's grandfather was in polar bears.
Yes.
And he writes, I've seen Bruce's articles, he writes some nasty things about the British. Because they were not under American control, they were under British control.
Oh, yeah?
Yes. And it was
Yeah.
nasty. We didn't care for him. That was polite, Bruce, that's the one it went.
He was in 1976, I believe, he was interviewed by Hope College, and he said if there was ever another war against England, he'd be one of the first ones to sign up.
Why did he say that?
Because they were treated like slaves.
Oh, interesting.
You know, they took away their overcoats and everything else, so the British could have it. Not a happy man about that.
Dude, I was saying to him, I didn't find much actually in our archive on personal experience. I hope to. Do you have anything else you want to share from what you've heard from that right now? Okay, he brought a book. Okay, sounds good. One of the other artifacts I grabbed from our collection is we have a uniform that has the polar bear insignia or patch on it. We have a couple of these patches. Actually, here's another one that I had donated.
I guess a lot of people don't know that our congressman, his grandfather was a polar bear, William Heisinger. Bill's named after him.
Oh yeah? Yeah, I didn't know that. So part of the thing I also found fun about this was a lot of my research before was all paper research. I had fun looking through our archives and seeing what we had too. So I showed you the jacket and some of the other things. On the screen are two artifacts that are on display at the museum that many of you have seen. Again, if you haven't, you should go check out the museum. So one of the things I enjoyed about these two artifacts was I learned about how aboard the men in the trenches were. So trench warfare was either you're in action, you're being shot at, or you're sitting there bored. And so it's cool to see these are two things that came from Zeeland boys that show how they spent their time when they were bored. There were a lot of small Bibles as well. This was a small portable checker set. And the one on the right is an example of what they call trench art. So it's a casing from a missile, a bullet, that they did artwork on.
The checker set was Wilma Bellier's father's,
Yeah.
and he was gassed during the war and was never the same
Really?
after he came back. He suffered for years and died young, and Wilma's mother had a terribly hard time after that.
Did he have physical effects afterwards?
Oh, yes, yes. From the gas.
From the gas? Yeah.
That was his checker set.
Yeah. Some of the other artifacts I pulled from the collection are, these are some gloves. These again shows that they're in a cold climate. The canteen, the knapsack, and the leggings that they had to wrap because their pants didn't go all the way down, and some hats. So after we're done, feel free to come look at some of these other artifacts that I pulled. There's also some coats in the entryway in the schools, in the mudroom, set up the school mudroom. I did pull all the names too of everybody who was considered a casualty. So casualties are not just people who died, but people who were wounded from Zeeland. So it shows everybody who was gassed, wounded, and killed. Gilbert Carson was the first boy from Zeeland who died. I have a letter that was published in the record from him in February, so he was killed in August of 1918. I thought I would read parts of this letter just to hear some of his words. So he wrote, "Dear editor, nothing to do this evening but write after answering all the letters from personal friends and relatives. I thought, why be so selfish? Perhaps some of the others would like to know how we're getting along. Well, I don't claim to be a news writer or a reporter, but I will try to find something anyways. I hope our many friends haven't formed the opinion that we have deserted them, but we've been awfully busy lately and only found time to write to our folks. And of course some fellows have their best girls to write to, but I'm not guilty of anything like that. We have a fine place here, and we're in the barracks and heated by a furnace on each floor. Hot shower baths and a place to wash our clothes. We are quarantined for scarlet fever and the measles, but I don't think any of the Zeeland boys are sick. We go on long hikes every morning with full equipment, and it is very hard to navigate on the roads. I presume all of our folks were excited when they heard our part of the division that was on the transport, the Tuscatania, which was sunk by the Sauerkrauts. There was a dirty, underhanded, underwater trick, but I suppose it is war. Nevertheless, we propose to get even with them, and if anyone doubts it, let them look at the expression on our faces when talking about it. Well, I hope, in fact, I know that we will have better luck. But anyway, I hope there will be no worry about this. There were actually some Zeeland boys on that ship. None of them died. I know there was at least one, and he got to the coast in Ireland. So, it's kind of interesting. Our camp is only 45 minutes from Broadway, so one night I went to see it, some city. I saw lots of things that are often mentioned in books and magazines, and which I've often pictured in my mind and wished to see. I wish I had some time to tell you all about it, but it is almost time for lights to go out, and we will have to close. Everybody is happy tonight, for tomorrow is Sunday, and no revile, we can sleep as long as we like. In closing, I wish to say that all Zeeland boys are well and happy in this place, and they will have a chance to get even with Fritz. They all send their best regards, including mine. Sincerely, Corporal Gilbert D. Carson. So Gilbert Carson inspired the name for the Gilbert D. Carson Post of the American Legion. So in that way, his legacy lives on in the American Legion. This is the founding members of the Gilbert D. Carson Post on the screen. There's also World War I's Veterans Association that met well into the 80s. I know into the 80s because I've seen minutes in our archive. I'm not sure exactly how long they met.
The second one from, in the first row from the right was a polar bear. From the right.
From the right.
Right there.
That one.
Yeah. He was from Greeceland. I can't recall his name.
I have a listing of the names somewhere. I can look it up for you. Yeah, so the Veterans Association would keep them up to date on their benefits. They also smoked a lot of cigars and took turns bringing in food. And as they were married, the women would meet at different restaurants while the men met in the Veterans Association. I had a couple fun facts that I found that didn't fit into the themes of anything I talked about, but I still wanted to share. One of them, Hope College ended their semester 2 weeks early in 1918, so the students could help with the farm work. due to a shortage of labor, which is kind of interesting. On March 1918, photographs were prohibited on the Grand Haven Pier due to it being a launching point. Zeeland churches also furnished a ladies' room at Camp Custer with fine furniture, and there was a letter from Camp Custer thanking them, saying it's the best furnished restroom in the camp. And Paul de Kruijf, who many of you know, is a famous Zealander microbiologist and author, enlisted to go to France to do research in Paris. So that's another example, I think, of how men used what skills they already had. So doctors would go over as medical personnel. Paul de Kruijf went over as a researcher because that was his skill set. I also have some resources that I wanted to share in case you're interested in doing any of your own record or research. So the Women's Defense cards are digitized, the Zeeland Record and other newspapers for whatever community you're looking at. The University of Michigan also has quite a bit on the polar bears online. They have some personal accounts, so if you're interested in reading more about that, they also have a list of other books on them. And here's a list of secondary sources, which I want to call out Anita, who's sitting over there. Her dissertation was really helpful for me when I was working on my research too. She researched with the Women's Committee specifically, so.
Not much was said about the Spanish flu at the time either. A lot of boys died of that.
Yes,
Yes.
yes,
And actually,
that is true.
a lot of those women who volunteered for nurse training ended up kind of pushed into that relief effort, especially bringing food and supplies to quarantine people from the Spanish flu.
And there were the nurses I saw mentioned who died of disease
Yeah.
overseas too. So it definitely is something that was prevalent. Yeah.
Zeeland had 6 deaths from flu, 2 from combat.
Yeah.
And some of those were at Fort Custer, which had a huge breakout of the flu.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. So that concludes our presentation. Does anybody have questions or comments? Like I said, by some of the knowledge of some here. Yeah, Mary?
My 7th and 8th grade teacher was a World War I vet. And he grew up in this area, but I don't think he was specifically from Zeeland. His name was Jack Arts. And it was, because I like history anyway, and he took some artifacts along to class that he had from the war, his helmet, and his gas mask. Now, do you have that among any of the
I do. I call this a knapsack, but it's actually a gas mask.
Yeah, I got one of those at home.
Yeah, so
But they didn't use them in Russia.
no, they didn't.
You have to be really careful. That's gonna almost come apart if it gets so brittle after a while.
Yeah, I'll just pull it out so you can see it. But, yes, so we have a couple others actually in our collection too, but you're right, they weren't used in Russia. They were only used in the trenches in France. So.
in the trenches?
Mhm.
And there's not a lot about that.
Yeah.
They got lice when they were in the trenches.
Yeah.
They got those in Russia too, even in the cold.
Nice and right.
Yeah. Yeah.
A number of historical novels that I've read have talked about men having a lot of face injuries, and these masks that they would make for them out of iron,
Yeah.
and then how they ended up being poisoned because of that iron. Do you have any?
No, that's really interesting. I didn't see any examples of that in the research, but that I know that happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Kit, did you have something?
Yeah, there was disdain for the Germans to the effect that the town of Berlin, over where the Berlin Ferry is, changed its name to Marne. Even though it's a region of Germany, it was less German. President Eisenhower's family changed the spelling of their name,
Yep.
Yeah.
and they didn't want to be associated with the Germans. And then the United States had done so much for the Allies that when it came time to build planes, which were made out of wood, spruce. There were two gentlemen from up north where Bruce's grandpa lived that were put into what they called the spruce division. They were sent to Washington State to lumber. They were lumberjacks in a sense, and they used that spruce to build the airplanes that the Allies needed for overseas.
Oh, really?
Guys in Michigan, is that where,
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting.
Wisconsin guy?
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts or knowledge?
I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned the Boy Scouts at the beginning, the local Boy Scouts here in Zeeland. Did you see where they were actively involved in knitting and sewing like in other areas?
I didn't see that in Zeeland.
Okay.
No. I know that happening. I saw that in Grand Rapids.
Yeah. No, I didn't know if it was just
Yeah.
a few locales or if it, yeah.
The other thing I didn't mention is kids were really involved in agricultural production. So they were encouraged to start their own war gardens. They were agricultural clubs for both boys and girls at home to learn how to grow food at home. So, yeah.
Did they ever find out who committed the pole theft?
No.
That case ever closed?
Well, I didn't see anything.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
feel free to come and look at some of the artifacts I have pulled. And also, like I said, there's some other coats in the mud room over there. And also, there's food and coffee in the back. And so, feel free to mingle.